When I first read Empire of Silence, a little over 3 years ago now, I came out of it not feeling like it was a perfect novel, but still incredibly impressed by what Christopher Ruocchio managed to achieve with it as a debut. A little bit earlier in this year, I reread it and did a scripted re-review of it to coincide, much like I am doing now with Howling Dark, and that experience was incredible. True, I had already reread Empire of Silence and Howling Dark back in summer of 2023, and already gotten a lot more from each experience than I could have imagined compared to my first go-around back then. But as I expressed in my re-review of the introductory novel of The Sun Eater, despite how many things I felt like I missed, my experience wasn't altogether that much different in the grand scheme of things. So I felt convicted in my thoughts on the two books, together making the first act of The Sun Eater, but my resolution of opinion wasn't upheaved. Well, just as with Empire of Silence, which I reread with the updated text and having Disquiet Gods in direct context, and even Shadows Upon Time in immediately following context additionally beyond that, I also reread Howling Dark with the updated text, one of the very few, if not only to see it, other than Christopher himself up to that point. Of course, this means that I also had the entire series in direct context with the book, because I had already read Shadows Upon Time. I cannot express to you how much better these two books both are with that context in mind. I will try to explain it here without spoilers still, because I want everybody to read these books, but I fear I will be unable to find the words that I want for that task to do so suitably. Pray listen, lend me your ear, and I will try to tell you how Howling Dark is, to me, the perfect sequel to what Empire of Silence was. First things first, for those folk who may be wondering, if you didn't love Empire of Silence and are unsure about whether or not you should continue the series, what is an easy recommendation up front here in my review? Well, that depends on what you mean by didn't love, to be completely clear. If you disliked the first book, or worse, you hated it, Howling Dark doesn't have the highest chance in the world of changing your mind. It could, and I wouldn't entirely count that out, but as a general rule of thumb, if you have outright negative sentiment about Empire of Silence broad scale, Howling Dark is probably not worth checking out. That said, I will still usually recommend people read it in most cases anyway. Why? Well, simply put, Howling Dark is better than its predecessor in effectively every conceivable metric. The only real exception is the minor coming-of-age kind of thing Empire of Silence has going on, but one could even argue that's still being continued in the sequel in regard to Hadrian coming to actually understand what he's up against and letting go of his prior assumptions about the universe. But in every other way, the sequel does it better than does the debut. The pacing is better, although you still have a lot of build-up in the first half to be sure. The series plot is moving forward. There are huge moments that significantly outshine any in Empire of Silence on both lore and action fronts, and it is in essence the end of the first act of the series. If by the end of Howling Dark you still aren't really feeling the series or are still uncertain, it's almost certainly not going to click for you overall, and you are free to end off knowing you gave it a very honest shot. I wouldn't blame anyone for that if that's where their tastes fall. Though these two books aren't short, you are only reading like a quarter of the total series, and in the realm of epic sci-fi fantasy, for a series that is, without including side material, nearly 2 million words long, that's actually not too bad of a bargain. But if it does work for you, or if it does change your mind from Empire of Silence, which, mind you, is absolutely not an uncommon occurrence, you're in for a series that you'll absolutely devour. And that's just part of what makes Howling Dark the perfect sequel. Howling Dark makes incredibly clear that Hadrian is not going to hold your hand with his narration of his life, and does so right from the outset. In fact, it makes this so clear from the very first moments that there are some, honestly, somewhat valid criticisms that there's too much whiplash here right at the start of Howling Dark. But Rocchio's genius in making the decision he made is multifaceted. First of all, it starts in very disorienting fashion. Hadrian awaking from fugue, or this world's version of cryosleep. Within this waking sequence, we are met with memories and visions of events and characters that actually occur in between Empire of Silence and Howling Dark, because there's been a multiple decade time jump there. Nigh 50 years have passed, and Hadrian is 12 years older. Some character dynamics are different, and there are no small number of straight-up new characters, too. You might assume that you've missed a book in between these two if you have no idea that this is coming, which, the vast majority of people are going to experience. Nearly every new book in the series features some manner of time jump, but Howling Dark brilliantly, purposely makes itself the most disorienting to familiarize the reader with the decision before it's even made again. And to pair with the time jump and the changes in character dynamics and new characters, etc., as mentioned before, Christopher has left open two various pieces of the story that he can opt into writing about in the future, which he has already started doing with short stories to pair along with special editions of the main series. On the 23rd of October 2025, should be just 2 days from this video's release, on this very channel, I will be posting a video that goes over more of the Sun Eater as a series and reading orders and stuff like that in more detail, so check that out if you're interested. Yet, Christopher is not so cruel as to completely abandon the reader here. Though he uses Hadrian to narrate the story, referencing things left off the page in between books, Christopher the author still forms a fully coherent whole novel with Howling Dark, and every future novel too. So fear not, everything that you need to know is there, but most of it is expanded upon in time rather than laid out as explicit exposition. Fantastic decision. So, first, Christopher trusts his readers with Howling Dark in a way that expands upon what he already did at Empire of Silence. Good. What else does he do? The next thing is that Christopher tightens up the pacing notably. Some make the valid criticism that most of the first half of Howling Dark is still a lot of relatively slow build-up, the way that much of Empire of Silence was, but this time Christopher sprinkles in some important brief action sequences throughout, intermixing these sequences with the typical lore and character interactions and starkly visual world building. You also get to experience some truly new cultural aspects of the galaxy in this book in ways I will not inherently spoil, but at all the various points when Hadrian experiences shock about what he's experiencing, so too are you, the reader. This invests you so much more than Emish in the prior book managed to do, at least for me. Furthermore, with every act of the book, you know exactly what's being aimed at, the goal, and Christopher takes you there fluidly, which one can't exactly say about Empire of Silence, which is much slower, largely in part due to how much wandering energy it has. Howling Dark converts that wandering into direct drive, and this makes it quicker to read. But some of what the sequel does so well, particularly when comparing it directly to the debut, is not just what it fixes per se, it's what it merely does even better than was already good. Empire of Silence already succeeded at forward-thinking lore, for example. I specifically called out the chapter at Caliga entitled I Dare Not Meet in Dreams in my re-review of that book, and if you think that chapter was epic, especially on a reread, and it is epic, don't get me wrong, it's got nothing on the chapter Brethren in this book. Reading it once is enough for readers to realize just how crazy things are, and how crazy they're going to get later in the series, but once again, the reread just really accentuated how prescient Rocchio was with the series despite the time and the changes that occurred through them. Rather than retconning important things, you just see how much he could really pull from his more vague plans to draw out the best from Hadrian's tale. Another example is the relationship of Hadrian with himself in the narrative, e.g. narrator Hadrian versus his younger counterpart within the story. Though the philosophical insertions of Empire of Silence are something I enjoy a good bit and liked even more on a rereading, as the series goes on, Christopher does a much better job inserting briefer, more poignant, and also more naturally fitting examples of narrator Hadrian's introspection into the broader narrative. Howling Dark is already immediately a much better example of this dynamic than was the first book. I know a certain contingent of readers who actually preferred Empire of Silence's tactic on this front, but I certainly much preferred the evolution of it over time. But part of this as well is the next point. By the end of this first act of the series, you have a pretty solid grasp on who Hadrian's naive effectively teenage self is like, and you have also come to understand largely the narrator's temperament strongly enough to be able to move forward without such intense insertions. Hadrian's not info dumping as much as a narrator. Knowing this dynamic allows us an additional point of reference as Sun Eater moves into its second act with Demon in White in brilliant ways, which is basically the last major point I want to make here. Howling Dark sets up what is to come much better than Empire of Silence does. I mean, sure, you leave Emesh with a goal. Locate Vorgosos. That's the goal, but otherwise you close off that novel without having that much active direction and with only that one vague target, no way to get there. Howling Dark shifts the series into kind of the opposite style of ending, where Christopher suggests that some of the changes that are to occur in between novels so that the time jumps aren't as jarring, and also where Christopher doesn't tip his hand so much with what will happen in the next book, and more so with giving the reader a glimpse at the implications that the ending might have on the temperamental state of the galaxy writ large. To me, this is so much more interesting, a much better way to handle it, and it leads into the politics that make the bulk of Demon in White's opening act so good. Christopher Rocchio has stated that Howling Dark is essentially his favorite novel, largely because it was the easiest and smoothest production process. This was due in large part to the fact that he started outlining with Howling Dark, where Empire of Silence certainly did not have that benefit. Well, you can feel it here, and it's fantastic. Howling Dark has also for a long time been tied for my favorite of Sun Eater. There's not much more I can really say to praise this thing, other than it is actually worth reading. If the climax of Howling Dark doesn't just really excite you, I really don't understand. I don't know what would. Like, there are things Christopher does with the narrative in this book that you can't do as an author, and it still worked. No other words, really. So I'll leave off this re-review here. The edits made for the special edition text in Howling Dark aren't so extensive as they were in Empire of Silence, but I once again recommend trying to access that text if it is possible for you. Hopefully DAW does a deluxe edition / ebook refresh with Howling Dark like they are doing for Empire of Silence, because the wider populace being able to have access to the improvements, albeit hardly noticeable in most cases, is totally worth it in my opinion. Most particularly for rereaders, sure, but that doesn't negate my conviction. Howling Dark is the perfect sequel to Empire of Silence and the perfect close to Act 1 of what is ultimately my favorite series of all time. I cannot recommend Sun Eater highly enough, but I can at least be content if people read these first two to determine whether it is truly for them or not. Thank you so much for watching this re-review of Howling Dark. I hope you enjoyed it. As a friendly reminder, For anybody who doesn't know, if you're watching this video before November 2025, tickets for the Shadows Upon Time release gala event in Raleigh, North Carolina are still available at highmatterbooks.com. If you want to attend, that is happening on Saturday, November 15th, but there are still only a limited number of tickets available, so get in before they're gone or before they come off sale after October 31st, whichever happens first. I will be attending alongside several other booktubers like Mike from Mike's Book Reviews and Richard and Austin from Two to Ramble, plus several more. That's all I have for the close of this video, so thank you again for watching. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys at the release event in North Carolina.